Hello, many of you have requested that I make a video about the Canadian Armed Forces, or the Force Armée Canadienne if you're a francophone, and I'm really happy to comply. The Canadian Armed Forces are often overlooked by everybody, least of all by the Canadians themselves, who tend not to think about their armed forces, and I bet most of them don't even realize that they have a military, which I think is a real shame. We're going to talk about that because Canada, I mean, at least by reputation alone, they have really fabulous armed forces, at least in terms of the sort of the size of the fight in the dog, if not the size of the dog itself, which these days, frankly, is too small. But we'll get into that. I mean, often Canada has punched well above its weight militarily, and in the past, when circumstances have required, Canada has evolved and made itself into a major military power. If you don't believe me, look at the Canadian contributions to World War One, World War Two, and also the Korean War. Hell, in World War II, it's easy to forget that Canada was actually at Normandy. I mean, we think about the Canadian, most of us think about Normandy, the D-Day invasions, as like, well, the Americans, and then maybe the British were also there, depending on what movies we're watching. But also the Canadians were there, and we forget about them. In fact, they even had their own beach, Juno Beach. 14,000 Canadian soldiers landed at Juno Beach on D-Day, and they fought their way through France and into Germany like everybody else, and they liberated the Netherlands. They really played a major, major role. We forget about this. Now, I think ultimately the reason is because there are no movies about it. There's no Saving Private Mackenzie or the Soldat Tremblay. And by the way, I'm convinced that half of Canadians are named either Mackenzie or Tremblay, but whatever, I digress. There is a decent movie about the Canadians World War One called Paeschendaele. It's actually quite good. The battle scenes are phenomenal. I've read that it's the most expensive Canadian movie ever made, and if you watch it, you'll see that clearly they put all the money into the battle scenes. It's actually all on YouTube, so I put a link into the description of the YouTube video, and I highly recommend that you watch it. It's really quite good. The battle scenes, by the way, are at the sort of the beginning section and then at the end of it, and then there's also sort of stuff in the middle. There's a romance and whatever. Anyways, it's a good movie. It's worth watching. But the bottom line for me is that if you find yourself in a fight and if you find that there are Canadians at your side, you should count yourself lucky. And even today, when, as we shall see, the Canadian military really is too small in terms of professionalism and skill, they're really, really very good. So you can have faith that they are going to fight well, and you're going to be grateful that they're there. But what about today? Now, there's a lot to say about the Canadian Armed Forces, or the CAF, as I think some people say, at least I tend to say. But perhaps even more interesting is Canada's overall military policy and its approach to national security, which should inform the kind of military that it has. Canada, as we shall see, has a very unique strategic position. This is both a disadvantage and an advantage. The disadvantage is that it encourages Canada to not prioritize defense and to think that defense really even doesn't even matter. I mean, Canada, honestly, is one of those few countries that could probably get away with not spending a dime on defense, which is the case for Iceland and Ireland, which are two other countries that, for various reasons, honestly have no reason to spend any money on their defense because they've got big, powerful neighbors who are going to take care of them. The advantage, however, is that the sort of the specificity of Canada's strategic position should give Canadians a very clear idea of what they do need and what they should be spending their money on in terms of defense. This is actually an advantage in the sense that it narrows the list of choices, it narrows the list of requirements. It should make it easier for Canada to make the decisions that other countries struggle with. I'm going to do this video in three parts. The first part, I'm going to talk about sort of the facts, the Canadian defense budget, the state of the Canadian military, et cetera, et cetera. The second part, I'm going to talk about Canada's strategic position and their military policy. In the third section, I'm going to try to pull it all together to talk about, all right, well, given all of this, like where is CAF, what can CAF do, but really what kind of force should CAF be? Particularly now that the Canadians finally are talking about increasing their defense spending. So what should they be doing with their money? My name is Michael Shurkin, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Pax Americana, a conversation about world affairs, global conflict, military strategy, and anything else that happens to be in my mind. And of course, if watching this video you decide that you like it, please don't be afraid to hit like and subscribe. It helps my channel a great deal. Thank you. So part one, let's get into this, the facts, okay? Canada is among NATO's lower spending countries. It has an annual defense budget of around $31 billion Canadian, which works out to 50 cents American. No, I joke. It's about $22.8 billion American. That's maybe 1.3% of GDP. This April in 2024, Ottawa announced plans to spend an extra 8.1 billion Canadian over the next 5 years and a total of 73 billion Canadian more over the next 20 years. That should bring spending up to a little over 1.7% of GDP. The money will go to a long list of new and overdue items, although it will remain to be seen naturally how much of this Canada actually spends and what they in fact will buy. Often the Canadians use language like, well, we will buy up to X number of items, when the real number that Canada obtains might end up being half of X or something like that. So only time will tell. The Canadian Armed Forces have three main branches. There's the Army, the Royal Canadian Navy, and the Royal Canadian Air Force. Yes, royal because Canada is a monarchy and its soldiers and sailors and airmen all bend the knee to King Charles III. The reason why it's the Canadian Army rather than the Royal Canadian Army, I believe that the Canadians simply are following the line from the British, because it's the British Army, but the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force, for historical reasons having to do with the origins of the British Army, etc., etc. Now, at several points in history, Canada's military has been huge. In World War II, the Canadian military had 1 million men and women in its ranks. During the Cold War, Canada even had 3 aircraft carriers, or at least 3 by my count. Canada's military, however, went through significant cuts in the 1960s. I don't really know enough about Canadian history, the domestic history, to understand why this was the case, but it was the case. So the force went from about 120,000 overall to about 80,000 over the course of the 60s. It stayed that size in the 70s and 80s before there were further cuts in the 1990s under Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. Chrétien was prime minister from 1993 to 2003. All I really know about Chrétien was that, according to my Quebecois roommate in graduate school, he was the first Canadian prime minister who spoke neither French nor English well. Now, in April 2024, 2 Canadians penned a very good article in War on the Rocks with the title, "Don't Count on Us, Canada's Military Unreadiness." And they painted a very gloomy picture of the CAF. It said that because of Canada's strategic culture, and I'll say more about that later when I talk about Canada's strategic position, that Canadians at some point lost interest in defense and preferred to lavish all of their money on social programs. Part of the problem, they said, was that Canadians were content to rest on their laurels, their reputation coming out of the 2 world wars in Korea. The War on the Rocks article compared them to out-of-shape former high school star athletes who clung to their glory days. Now, today, the overall size of the Canadian military, it's about 63,000 regulars and another 22,000 reservists. Canada also has an interesting component known as the Canadian Rangers, with about 5,300 men and women in it. And I'm going to talk about them later. The current plan is to grow the force to about 71,000. Now, the breakdown is as follows. The Canadian Army has about 28.6 thousand with 16,000 reservists. Plus the 5,300 Rangers. As far as I've been able to figure out, the 5,300 Rangers do not count among the 16,000 reservists, even though Canada regards the Rangers as a reserve force. If I'm wrong about that, please let me know in the comments. The Canadian Air Force has about 15,000 in it, 15,500, plus another 2,200 reservists. And the Canadian Navy, Royal Canadian Navy, has 8.6 thousand active and about 3,000 reservists. Now, by all accounts, the Canadian Armed Forces is in really bad shape because of the decades of cuts and general inattention, combined with a fairly high operational tempo. By that, I'm really referring to Canadian involvement in various multinational deployments and whatnot that keep them very, very busy. As the article in War on the Rocks reports, Canada suffers from serious recruitment problems. One Canadian official has described it, quoted in the article, as being in a death spiral. Canada has too few ships, too few of them are operable, has too few planes, it struggles to contribute to various NATO endeavors like the Joint Task Forces, etc. Yes, Canada is planning to buy more ships and more planes, but they may be too few. And in any case, they won't become operational for at least another decade, which will leave significant capability gaps. Let's talk about the Canadian Army. The Canadian Army is sort of set up for covering the full spectrum of operations, but with 28,000 plus or minus people in it, it's hard to imagine that it could actually do that, especially not conduct heavy conventional warfare. To put it another way, Canada has aspired and aspires to having an army that's capable of, to have an army that's like a bonsai army, like the British or the French. But it's unlike them, or more so, much more so than the British or the French. It's missing a lot of limbs, and it's not going to offer much shade to anybody. Now, from what I can tell, the Canadian Army is built around 3 mechanized brigades and is designed to generate and sustain a brigade of about 4,800 people in it. These brigades are not up to scratch against a peer or near peer adversary. As far as I know, for example, they don't have things like self-propelled howitzers or rocket artillery, and their armored vehicles primarily are a mix of older LAV variants and tracked M113 variants. In the case of the LAVs, and LAVs LAV, for those of you who are not familiar, it's this whole family of armored vehicles, wheeled armored vehicles that I believe the Canadians are largely responsible for. I can't really tell you much more because I've never looked at it that closely. I'm sure you can go to Wikipedia and find out, and I bet there's a YouTube video somewhere that will go into the whole history of the LAV family. Anyways, I'm referring in the Canadian case to the Coyote and the Bison, which are basically armored personnel carriers with different variants tailored for some specific functions. They're based on the LAV-2 platform, which I'm sure means something to somebody. Canada does have 74 Leopard 2 tanks. It's a mix of 2A4s and Leopard 2A6s. Interesting story, by the way, about these tanks. Canada in the early 2000s decided to get rid of its tanks. It then had a fleet of Leopard 1s, and at the time, they just decided that these tanks were no longer useful. Nobody needed tanks anymore, and also they weren't really cut out for the sorts of things that the Canadian military was doing at the time, which were these peacekeeping operations in Africa or things like UNIFIL. So why bother? But in Afghanistan, the Canadians discovered that they actually needed the firepower that the tanks would have been useful for, the big guns, not so much the protection, but the big guns. And so they scrambled to come up with some. And what they did is they bought from the Dutch and the Germans some secondhand Leopard 2s. So that's where their Leopard 2s come from. What can you do with 74 main battle tanks other than simply cultivate institutional knowledge? I don't really know. But safe to assume that the utility in a NATO operation will depend entirely on their ability to interoperate with some larger unit that they'll be inserted into. And remember, though, if Canada were to deploy these tanks, it would have to rely on everybody else for the various supporting elements. So, there's a question of how useful is that if they don't bring with them these organic capabilities? Maybe they're even going to be more trouble than they're worth. Now that Ottawa intends to go on a spending splurge, there is a chance that it might buy new tanks, but I rather doubt it. It will replace the older LAV models, the LAV-2s and the M113s, with what they call the LAV 6.0, and they call this the Armored Combat Support Vehicle, or the ACSV. Americans should recognize these things because our Striker is a variant of the Canadian LAV, more or less. And again, I'm sure there's somebody who's going to chime in the comments and say, well, actually, the Striker is this or that or whatever. I'm not really that interested. And maybe one day I'll do a video about the LAV family, but it's really low on my list. Apparently, the Coyote and the Bison are the LAV-2 platform. The Striker is a LAV-3. And the new ACSV is basically just an upgraded LAV-3. What this means, again, whatever, I'll leave to other people. Before I leave the topic of the Canadian Army, I do want to point out that Canada boasts a high-speed Tier 1 SOF unit called the Joint Task Force 2, or JTF-2. It's smaller than comparable US and UK units like the SAS and the SBS, but they're really, really very good. The JTF-2 is no joke. Now, one mustn't forget the Canadian Rangers. The Rangers are categorized as a reserve force, and in many ways they resemble actually the American U.S. National Guard. They're divided into patrol groups. I think there are 5 of them. And they recruit locally. They recruit from remote northern and coastal populations. They recruit heavily from Inuit and various indigenous communities. Among other things, they have a lot of the local languages, and the Canadian military boasts of this. They talk about, I think it said, like 20 different local languages and dialects. They patrol, they move around, they talk to people. They're really very good. It seems clear to me that as the Arctic heats up, that this is actually a really one of the more useful and important assets in the Canadian military and the whole CAF. And if I were the Canadian Ministry of Defense, I would pay a lot of attention to the Rangers. I would make sure that they're very well funded, well equipped. I would try to give them the best, most up-to-date communications gear and ISR gear, so that they can do their job. Their job mainly being just being out there and talking to people. It's not really a combat element. I mean, they've got guns. They just got some new carbines or bolt-action rifles that replace some, I believe, like World War II vintage Lee Enfields. But that's not what they're for. Again, it's just talking to people and having eyes on, and I think that's actually an invaluable thing for the CAF. As for the Air Force, the Royal Canadian Air Force is going to benefit more than the Army from Ottawa's spending splurge. The Canadian Air Force has a fleet of about 76 1980s vintage F-18 Hornets, which the Canadians call the CF-18. As best as I could figure out, the CF-18 and the sort of the stock American F-18 Hornet they're the same thing, like 99.9% similar. I've read that, however, and they're going to replace these with 88 F-35s. Now, remember, of course, these numbers, and as I said, it's not clear if the Canadians are actually going to buy that number or something much smaller. The bad news is that I don't think they're going to get their first F-35 until 2026. And the F-35 fleet is not expected to be fully operational until 2032, 2034. This means that Canada is going to be stuck with its aging CF-18s for quite a while, like at least another decade. There's some talk apparently about obtaining some sort of interim fighter capability, but it's all about money and their willingness to spend that kind of money. Also on order are 9 Airbus A330 MRTTs. These are these really wonderful multi-purpose jets that do aerial refueling plus cargo. The French have some, and apparently they really like them. They're very useful, so it's a good thing. They're also talking about buying 14 P-8 Poseidons. These are maritime patrol aircraft. I don't remember if they're based on the 737 or 767. Also very good. But again, are they going to buy 14 or some smaller number? Plus, they're buying MQ-9 drones. As for the Navy, currently the Royal Canadian Navy has 12 Halifax-class frigates, 12 Kingston-class coastal defense vessels, 4 Harry DeWolf-class Arctic and offshore patrol vessels. These are new, and 2 more are coming. And Victoria-class submarines. These are 1980s vintage second-hand Royal Navy submarines, British Royal Navy submarines. Ottawa intends to replace the Halifax frigates with 15, remember these numbers, right? New Canadian surface combatant ships that they will classify as River-class destroyers, but they're based on the UK Type 26 frigate. And they also intend to replace the 4 Victoria-class submarines with 12, up to 12 new diesel attack submarines. In fact, I think just this month, September, they issued a formal request for information for these new submarines. And when I read, the leading contenders include some Saab models and some German diesel submarines models. Fun story about the submarines. In the 80s, the Canadians actually looked into acquiring nuclear-powered submarines, which actually, given geography, makes sense for Canada. I mean, setting aside just the sheer cost of purchasing nuclear submarines, but actually it was the United States that quashed this whole project for policy reasons that I don't think anybody really understands anymore, and I certainly don't. Particularly in light of the fact that right now the U.S. is so eager for the Australians to have nuclear-powered submarines. But at any rate, it's not on the table. Okay, so let's move then to part 2, and let's talk about Canada's security requirements, its defense policy, and its unique strategic position. The easiest way to do this is just to look at a map. Here's a map of Canada. Now, 3 things should be obvious to you just by looking at this map. The first is that Canada is attached to the hip with the United States. They're like conjoined twins, at least if the twins are like Arnold Schwarzenegger and Danny DeVito in terms of the power, the balance of size and power. Remember this movie from the 1980s? So what this means is that Canada, whether it likes it or not, is tied to the United States. Its fate is tied to that of the United States and to the strength and vigor and viability of the Pax Americana. Canada understands that this is just the way it is, and they lean into it. And they lean into the alliance, and it's very clear from the policy documents that the American alliance is really the cornerstone of Canadian defense. Now, the good news or bad news, depending on how you look at it, is that Canada is a country that does not have to spend a dime on defense, because the United States ultimately provides its defense and provides the conventional deterrence and the nuclear deterrence to keep Canada safe. There's a 0% chance of any kind of major ground invasion or anything like that, so the Canadians don't really have to worry about homeland defense, at least the same way that a lot of other countries do. Of course, the bad news is that Canada doesn't have to spend a dime on defense, and I think Canadians know this. They understand this, and this goes a long way to explaining why Canadians are so comfortable with spending as little money on defense as they do. Like, why do they need to spend billions and billions and billions of dollars on a defense if ultimately they don't even need to do any of it? The second thing that should be obvious to you from this map is that Canada is huge. I mean, I don't need to say anything more about that, but I do want to point out that Canada, certainly everything north of the 60-degree north latitude, is largely empty. There's lots of land, lots of islands, lots of water, very sparsely populated in it. And it would behoove Canada to be able to at least watch all of this space and to have a good idea of what's going on in it and around it. The third thing that should be obvious from this map is that Canada borders 3 oceans, and one of them, the Arctic Ocean, is heating up both literally and figuratively, which means that the Arctic Ocean increasingly is becoming an area, a theater for great power competition. I think this is something that should be foremost on the Canadians' minds. Let's turn to Canada's military policy. My main reference here is this document called Strong, Secure, and Engaged, which was published in April 2024. It's a very interesting text, and if you're a Canadian, I strongly recommend reading it. It's worth your time. The document has some really interesting observations about the evolving global picture, although weirdly enough, it stuffs that stuff, like the discussion about the global picture, into part 4, sort of towards the bottom, whereas most defense policy documents tend to have that front load that kind of information up in the front. I'm not sure what that says, but I think it says something about how the extent to which Canada is aware of the changing picture but tends not to think much about it, I guess. And the focus of the document is more, I think, on the well-being of the Canadian military and the families and support and garrisons and barracks and housing and that kind of thing. But anyway, here's some key highlights. Very, very briefly. First of all, balance of power. And it says, a degree of major power competition has returned to the international system. Second, importance of state competition. It says, Canada benefits from global stability underpinned by a rules-based international order. By the way, I've long maintained that this term rules-based international order is nothing more than a polite euphemism for the Pax Americana. Recent years, I'm returning to the text, recent years have witnessed several challenges. Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea is an example that has carried grave consequences. Activities in the South China Sea highlight the need for all states in the region to peacefully manage and resolve disputes in accordance with international law and avoid coercion and other actions that could escalate tension. Next, we have the importance of deterrence. Quote, the emergence of major power competition has reminded Canada and its allies of the importance of deterrence. And then it says that generally NATO and likewise minded states have thought about this in terms of conventional military deterrence, military capabilities that are required in the event of a conflict with a, quote, near peer, unquote. And then lastly, we've got a changing Arctic. It says, climate change combined with advancements in technology is leading to an increasingly accessible Arctic. A decade ago, few states or firms had the ability to operate in the Arctic. Today, state and commercial actors from around the world seek to share in the longer-term benefits of an accessible Arctic. This language is interesting. It's acknowledging that the Arctic is heating up, both literally and figuratively, but it's kind of understating it and understating the relevance of great power competition by saying that everybody wants to enjoy the benefits of the Arctic. Yeah, but that comes with something. There's some hard power implications to this kind of everybody wants to share the benefits of the Arctic. Now, the text then goes on to lay out 3 defense priorities. it says, so Canada should be strong at home, its sovereignty well defended by Canadian armed forces, also that are also ready to assist in times of natural disaster, other emergencies such as search and rescue. 2, secure North America, active in a renewed defense partnership with NORAD and with the United States. So again, we're leaning into the alliance. And 3, engaged in the world with the Canadian Armed Forces doing its part in Canada's contribution to a more stable, peaceful world, including through support for peace support operations and peacekeeping. I think the key word here in all of this is sovereignty. Arguably, the only reason why Canada needs a military at all, given the fact that the United States largely covers its defense requirements, is sovereignty. If Canada were to just give up on having a military, not spend any money on it, and have no fighter jets or planes or submarines or anything like that, then Canada would really be a vassal of the United States. It would be entirely dependent on it. So it needs a military, if for no other reason, for the sake of sovereignty. Now keep this in mind. We're going to get to this because I think this is a really, really key thing, and I think this is going to help us understand how Canada's military should move forward and how they should spend their money. Let's put it all together. There are really 3 priorities here. 1, asserting sovereignty, i.e. not relying too much on the United States while at the same time leaning into the U.S. alliance, because that's reality. 2, being able to make a meaningful contribution to NATO. And then 3, trying to be of use to the world stage beyond NATO. Now, given these 3 requirements, these 3 basic missions, can the CAF fulfill them? Or will the CAF be able to if Canada goes through with the spending spree that they're planning on doing? I'm going to argue that currently, no, CAF cannot meet the current priorities, although it will be a lot closer to being able to do it if the Canadians actually spend the money that they say that they're going to spend and buy the things that they're going to spend. Now, this past August, Richard Shamuka wrote a piece in War on the Rocks that said that in the 1990s, when Canada under Jean Chrétien was making huge cuts to the Canadian Armed Forces, it had as an aspiration to have a force, to maintain a force that was capable of the full spectrum of operations, notwithstanding its small size and high operational tempo. Shamuka argues that Canada should drop the presence of full spectrum capabilities and opt instead for specialization. I completely agree. That invariably carries a lot of risk for most countries, right? So this is something that I've also argued for the British, but I get it, that there's more risk for the British. For Canada, it's got a lot less risk just because it's conjoined at the hip with the United States. And thus, it doesn't need to do a lot of things that a lot of countries maybe need to have or need to be able to do. And the key, I think, is understanding the overlap between 2 of Canada's priorities. The first being sovereignty, and then the second is supporting NATO. The overlapping space is and should be the sweet spot for Canada and where they should focus their investment. So what am I talking about? Well, realistically, the best way for Canada to contribute to NATO is by fulfilling a sovereignty mission. Right? Even though the point of the sovereignty mission is simply not to be a vassal of the United States, but it has this wonderful dual purpose. And it amounts to controlling its vast spaces and having a presence in the 3 oceans that border it. And then of the 3, it would make total sense for Canada to focus on the Arctic Ocean and being able to operate in the Arctic Ocean and being able to operate in the Arctic altogether. And I think that it makes all the sense in the world for Canada to become a center of excellence for all things Arctic. Now, in contrast, I see no reason why Canada should concern itself with helping out in a European fight. Don't bother having a mechanized brigade even that's deployable for Europe. If you're going to have an army, if you're going to have a mechanized force, do it to maintain a key capability so that in the future, as circumstances require, it can be plussed up. So you want a skeletal force, maybe expand the reserve system. But either way, don't worry about it, because I think that in terms of supporting NATO in Europe, Canada can do that best by covering a lot of responsibilities, security responsibilities in the Arctic and in the waters of the Pacific and the Atlantic that are near Canada, because everything that it can do there is also stuff that the United States doesn't have to do, and then anybody else like the British don't have to do. If you like this video, please like and subscribe, and check out my other videos. There's some links here, and I put some relevant writings, including the War on the Rocks articles that I mentioned here, and the Canadian policy document that I've cited. I'll put that all in the description. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Bye-bye.